Good evening, everyone. It's very nice to have all of you back to yet another episode of Right Circle in association with Prabhaketan Foundation, presented by Sri Cements, and our associate sponsors are Spagia Foundation and SAS Women. We have with us a very, very special and a rare person. Rare, I say, because we have very few food writers in India. Food writers who do the kind of research Shylashri Shankar has done for her latest book called Turmeric Nation. She is, apart from being an author for this latest book, also a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. And apart from this, her various other specialty areas are constitutionalism, religious freedom. She's also worked on anti terror laws, on civil liberties, on some anti poverty initiatives. She also dabbles with crime fiction, has written long form essays and articles for various journals and magazines. And that is how I found her, frankly. And her earlier books include Scaling Justice, India's Supreme Court. The next one is Anti Terror Laws and Social Rights. Then, Battling Corruption, Has Narega Reached India's Rural Poor? Then the next one is A Secular Age Beyond the West, Religion, Law, and a State in Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. That's, you can see what a varied and multi-talented author we have with us today. Thank you so much, Alishri, for joining us for this very, very special book. It's a food narrative which is beyond compare and has added to some excellent writing from India. I have just one more announcement to make before we launch into our question answers and the session with Shailashri is that Prabhakatan Foundation has requested for all of you who are attending to send your postal addresses, and please note the number carefully. Send your postal addresses on 98292 92244 in the next 48 hours so that we can courier a copy of Shailashri's book to you all. And thank you once again, Shailashri, for joining us and to our audiences who are here with us. Sorry, I forgot to announce that I am the moderator for the session. just let's just keep it as simple as I can. Shailashri, how do you answer this question that you are what you eat? So how do you connect with food? Because for me, food is a memory. Food also is connected with science. Food is also a socio-cultural construct. It is also first and foremost a sensory experience. And food is also a sense of home. And sometimes, given the times we are in, um, it also gets connected with a sense of loss. So, how do you connect with food on all these
Okay.
levels?
Thanks, Meeta. I mean, it's a wonderful introduction. I didn't recognize myself. So thank you. And thank you to the foundation for, for this great opportunity. And thanks everyone for zooming in because I know it's really difficult these days with all this, overload of technology. Um, yeah, I mean, Turmeric Nation. The way I think about food and my connection to food is, earlier it used to be very unconscious. You just sort of ate. You were very passionate about certain things that you liked and disliked. But because I'm also an academic by training, I began to think more consciously about what is it about food that defines me as a person. And then I began to realize that a lot of things that we think are part of our personality are actually defined by how we were brought up. What kinds of thoughts did we have about purity and pollution? Whom we ate with? Like things like, do you eat juta? Right now, if you have in Muslim Islamic culture, it is considered to be an honor to be sitting around a table and eating off the same plate. Whereas, I was brought up in a situation where, in a tradition where you just could not eat anybody else's. um, leftovers, right? But you also have people who eat leftovers because that's all they can get, which is, and when we come to Dalit food, or people at the lower levels of the caste ladder, that's how food was food was sort of used in these different ways to sort of create hierarchy, to create sort of prejudices, but to also create sort of friendships, and who's an insider and who's an outsider. So when I started thinking about it more consciously, I realized that a lot of my habits were very intimately connected with food. So that's, so you're right totally about food sort of connecting with all the different gamut of emotions that we experience, love, loss, longing, flavor, happiness, a whole bunch of them. And so that's what I did in the book, is I sort of went through all of these different things connected with food, but I went and did. I went and sort of went in with questions, and then did looked at the research on these questions for the answers, because I have my own personal answer, but but to think about India, you needed one needed more research, and so I sort of piggybacked on these other scholars who came up with answers. So that's how I sort of wrote this book. Yeah.
Right. The title of the book is very, very fascinating. Why did you call it The Turmeric Nation? And how did you land up writing a book like this? Like what went behind?
Yeah. So, but first, I have to say thank you to you, because I would never have thought of making it into a book. I began as a series of essays, and I was writing these essays for Open Magazine, and that also sort of happened totally by chance, because I'm a political scientist, and the editor said, would you like to write for us? And I said, look, I don't want to write about political science per se. I want to write about something different. And he took a chance on me, and he said, sure. I mean, I said, can I write about food? And he said, sure. And so I began. And what I did was with this is to the way I wrote these essays was to, as I said, I began with questions, and then I sort of let my mind wander for the answers, and then I went off and looked at these different disciplines like archaeology, sociology, anthropology, a whole bunch of them, history. And so when I was thinking of, and when Meeta, you got in touch with me and said, how about a book? Um, then it became clear that it couldn't be about me. It was all very personal, and nobody cares about me. I mean, they're interested in India. But to think about India was very difficult, because I couldn't find anything that was pan-Indian. You couldn't say that everybody in India thought about food in exactly this way. So I found that very difficult. And then I realized when I was looking into these archaeological discoveries, that turmeric was found in the Harappan archaeological sites, and in Haryana there's one of the sites, and they found these cooking pots, and turmeric was in those cooking pots. And so I just sort of thought turmeric is something that goes all the way back there, and genetically too, we can trace our ancestry all the way back to the Harappan civilization. So, we are a mix of like three genetic pools, but the Harappan one is the most ancient one. So I thought turmeric would make great sense, because we're also like, there's all the saffron stuff going on over here. So turmeric bleeding into saffron. So yeah, so that was the reason. uh,
When we began, we spoke about food and our different connects with food. But and interestingly, I'm noticing a lot of changes in our own ways of reacting to food and situations connected with menu planning or what's being cooked at home.
yeah.
The domestic scene has become more political than personal since the
Hmm.
lockdown. So, how do you think the relationship between a husband and wife works when it comes to food? Especially when you
Yeah.
mentioned that your husband is rather stoic.
Yeah. So we shouldn't actually wish for something. We might get it and then we don't want it, right? So that's what actually happened with this, because I wrote this whole essay on how, I was a gourmand and he was a stoic. And, even though he had a gourmand palate, he was very stoic about eating papaya that tasted like nothing, whereas I wouldn't eat a papaya that tasted that way, right? So I was like, oh, why can't he be more of a gourmand? But now with the lockdown, I'm cooking, and I must say he's no longer stoic. And so it is. And I'm like wishing for the days when he could go back to being stoic and eat anything I provide, but it doesn't work that way. So yeah, so I don't think one should wish for things, you might actually get it and then regret it. So yeah, so there is that.
Yeah, so now you have to plan your menus in detail and work towards that.
Yes, and the thing is that I also have a mother-in-law at home. So my mother-in-law is about almost 90. Has She eats a very different kind of food to what my husband likes. So let me give you an example. Like rice, rice has to be made separately for him. Because the rice grain can't be overcooked, and for her it has to be completely overcooked. So can you imagine making like, and then she can't eat chilies. He only wants spicy food. So it's it's very, very difficult,
I'm sure
but it's
everybody who's
okay.
listening to us is going to identify with what you're saying. I mean, I could narrate tons of tales like this, and I face it every day.
Yeah.
Um, so when we connect with food at different levels, the way we eat and all of that. So you've talked about various kinds of ways of identifying your sense of self and what food means to you through the book. Is there some way that, well, and you've also mentioned that our ancestors do determine the way we absorb nutrients that are there in our food. And what does it tell us about what the right kind of diet is for us? Because those are questions that you've dealt with in your book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are lots of, going on a diet is a major fad, right? So and a lot of people I know, for instance, follow these, sort of eating only meat, or having having only Subway sandwiches, or trying to lose weight in those ways. And it's very West, we always look to the West for these kinds of diets. But when you look at some of the research that comes out, what you find is that our genetic dispositions are very different from, say, the Western one, right? So in India, as I said, we trace our ancestry to three different streams of, um, uh, of population. So one is the Harappan. Then you also have you have like this ancient Iranian sort of mountain people, and then you also have um, the steppe population, which comes in from Central Asia. And but so when you have this kind of a genetic sort of disposition, we have to sort of think about what our grandparents ate. So what I did was I sort of looked at, I had high cholesterol, so I wanted to bring it down naturally. So I did an experiment on myself. I went back to the diet that the kinds of foods that my grandparents would have eaten, and I also went back to the kinds of thing the timing of the meal. That also made a big difference. And actually, I found after 4 months that given my diet, which was my grandparents' diet, because that's as far back I could go, you one actually found that it had actually come down. My cholesterol levels had come down from extremely high to sort of borderline high. So what that told me was, and maybe it may not work for everyone, but it's based on my own experience and also on this research. What it tells you is that you have to be conscious about the kinds of food that your ancestors ate. And in India, since we all trace it back to these particular gene pools, if you go back to, they say, the Harappan civilization, and you look at the cooking pots, we still eat a lot of those kinds of things, like the dals and things like that. And these archaeologists who found these cooking pots and the starches actually provide made food, and they found that even now in those in India and in those villages, they actually eat the same kind of food. So they found like millets and mangoes and vegetable and fish and barley and wheat and rice, and they also found ginger, garlic, eggplant, and turmeric in a handi from that period. And we still use all of these to cook our meals, right? And so I think, and then when you go back to also, when you also look at how Indian food, what could be common in a lot of Indian food is also, we sort of go by Ayurveda or the Unani school, right? So, and both Ayurveda and Unani, they focus on equilibrium, and they focus on sort of saying, look, you need, if you eat a mango which is hot, then you have to have something cool along with the mango, right? So you have to balance it, and even in your cooking, you have to do that. So I think we follow these traditional principles in the way regional cuisines particularly follow these traditional principles, but we also seem to look to the West, and we also go towards the processed food and fast food, and that may not agree with our constitution quite as much if we have it in great we have it in, yeah, we have a lot of it. We can do it in moderation, that, I mean, nobody's saying not to, but I think to just go on that diet is actually not very good for our system. And that's what I found when I was doing the research on this. So yeah.
Right. So that also then brings me to another question, because you've dealt with it in the book, is the foods that the Dalits eat. What is it that defines the food that they eat? Because it's a completely different social, cultural, religious construct.
Yeah. So Dalits, I mean, I was horrified when when I interviewed this person named Chandrabhan Prasad. He started this website called dalitfoods.in, and he's a Dalit from, and but he's done very well for himself now. I'm so sorry. He's done very well for himself. But what has happened is that with Dalit food, what he asked me was, I said, "What is Dalit food?" And he says, "Oh, have you eaten bread made of dried peas?" And it turns out that that's what they grew up eating. They were foraging in the forests. They only got peas. And then the landlords used to pay them, instead of paying wages, the wages used to be sugarcane juice, and then they were also given barnyard millet, along, like with the animals, they were also given barnyard millet. And so that's the kind of food he grew up with. And once in a while they would eat, if they had a feast and they had a little bit of money, once in a while they would eat, sort of the pig, and they would roast this pig, and they would roast the skin and have the crackling and all of these things. And then they would have a chutney made with with the blood, along with, sort of, with chilies and salt. And so it was really, to me, this was completely alien, because one didn't grow up that way, right? So I realized that we all live in such insular little bubbles, and to think about how much hunger there must be, and to have the same dried peas every single time, was really shocking. And then at the same time, I was watching this program called Chef's Table, and where it was about Favakin, which was a Swedish restaurant, which is among 50 best restaurants in the world. And the Favakin, the philosophy was to forage, to go, to sort of, to use every part of the animal, or the vegetable. And I realized, here we are, the same kinds of concepts are being discussed in the West, where it's a fashion, and here it's about choice. I mean, they just didn't have the choice, and they had to eat these peas. So it was just, I mean, to me, it was just this very stark sort
So,
of,
it's about survival here.
yeah, totally. And so, and also, this whole thing about, we all now, everybody talks about ancient grains and millets and all that. But what they also found was that, when you eat millets and only millets and nothing else, you could get goiter. So it's to do with again, I think it's to do with how you distribute all of these things in your diet, but they didn't have the choice. So in fact, one of the things he told me was that when these people come for a to look at with a marriage proposal, the girl's family asks, do they eat haldi ya dal? And that again connects to the turmeric in the turmeric nation, because haldiya dal was something they never used haldi in the dal, and they didn't even have dals, right? So and for us we think, oh, dal and haldi in dal is very common, it's a staple, but it's not. And it was it was a coveted dish. And so if the person said yes, then they knew that the groom's family was relatively, not badly off, and they could actually eat haldiya dal. So that and they never asked, do they cook food? And there were also no taboos. So when we think about taboos for the rest of the people, within Hinduism and Islam and Christianity and all, you have lot different taboos. But
Yes.
here there was no taboo, because obviously, and I asked the question, and then I said, why am I asking this question? Because there's no food. I mean, how can you, whatever food you eat, whatever
Get
food you
you.
get, you eat. So it just sort of made me realize that we live in very insular bubbles, and it was just a real eye opener, to see that. And I think with COVID, unfortunately, a lot of people have gone to that level of not having enough food,
Yes.
and it's extremely disturbing because of that. Yeah,
Yes, that has created a lot of anguish.
yeah.
So, given that we are in the present times, how do you deal with the concept of a national cuisine? And how are like how are some of these traditions invented? Even while we talk about national cuisine, how coffee began to be drunk in South India,
Hmm.
whereas tea remains something that's more local and more entrenched in the North Indian traditions.
Yeah.
And then we try and relate to a national cuisine. So how do we kind of piece this jigsaw puzzle?
Yeah. So again, with the national cuisine, the it came back to this question of what is Indian cuisine, right? So can we actually pinpoint something and say this is Indian cuisine? What you find is a hybrid. So what I actually found was there were it's like Naipaul's A Million Mutinies. That's what it is. It's a wonderfully, and it's just really exhilarating, and it's really chaotic, and it's very pluralistic, but it's a hybrid. So every part of India will say this is, dokla is the national cuisine, or chicken, whatever, butter chicken is a national cuisine, or something. Every dosa is a national cuisine. So, but national cuisines historically, if you look at other countries, usually it's either war or nationalism that produces a national cuisine. So in England, for instance, when they were at war with Napoleon, the English sort of rural gentry began to sort of only eat English food and not French food, because the aristocrats were eating French food, and so they wanted to make it into an English sort of versus, and because the French, they were at war with the French. The Japanese did the same thing, where what they did was, when they were during the Second World War, they had people from different parts of Japan in these military canteens, and the military canteens then took a whole bunch of Chinese and Japanese and Western cuisine, put it together, and made it into a Japanese cuisine. So, but in India, we've sort of followed a very different path. We've had sort of princely cuisines. So you have like all the Mughals, and before the Mughals, you have different kings. So you have that, and then you have the colonial period. So that sort of comes into this cuisine. And then you have the post-colonial period, which is independent India, where you have all the regional cuisines also coming in, and peasant cuisines coming in. So over a long period of time, our cuisine has been very hybrid. It's got both imperial, colonial, and peasant, sort of everyday cuisines all mixed together. And so when you think about a national cuisine, all we can say is it's a very hybrid regional set of regional dishes that
Right.
form the spine. And coming to this, how our traditions invented. I grew up drinking coffee. I'm from Madras, and I thought it was a very old tradition. And it turns out it only came in during the early part of the 20th century. In fact, just after the First World War, because when you during the First World War, they couldn't really get rice water, and so that's rice water used to be what they used to drink in the morning, and they couldn't get it, and so then they switched to coffee. But even coffee had a caste, because only the Brahmins were having coffee, and the non-Brahmins had tea. Whereas in the north, you had all of them. It was a much more sort of the tea was drunk by everybody. So it was, the traditions also get invented, because just there are all these wonderful little anecdotes where some people, somebody writes to Gandhi. This is before the First World War, saying, our women, and this is a Brahmin person writing to Gandhi, saying, our women are getting corrupted by this drink, this called coffee, and they're becoming, so you will not have any nationalism in the South, because they're all being corrupted by coffee. So, you know, so there were all these concerns expressed about coffee, and then you find that now it's sort of, it's considered to be a very great South Indian tradition, but it's not really that old. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, so, and then since you've mentioned war and nationalism, what was the role of bread and lemonade and beef in our freedom struggle?
Yeah, so that again, something that we've been, or we still are grappling with. Think of this biryani versus poha, or think of vegetarian versus non-veg. Think of the cow, the cow vigilantes. What was happening was, during the 19th century, early part of the 19th century, you had the Brahma Samaj, and and a lot of young men were joining Brahma Samaj, and some of their diaries show that they joined Brahma Samaj because Brahma Samaj did not forbid them to have bread and lemonade. Now, bread and lemonade were actually made either by the lower castes or by Muslims. So the upper caste people couldn't have that; it was taboo. But Brahma Samaj did not make it taboo. So there are these one diary entries where, the Nabichandra Sen, and he writes about how, because of this thing called bread, the circular thing called bread, which is manna from heaven, he joined Brahma Samaj. Otherwise, he wouldn't have joined it. So you have that, and then towards the late part of the 19th century, you have um, the same. What the nationalists tried to do was, they wanted to create a homogenous group, right? So what they did was, they made this sort of distinction between the cow worshippers and the beef eaters. So so there were these cow protection societies that Tilak and others were setting up, and Vivekananda was also part of all of this. And in these cow protection societies, they also had these revolutionary cells, and they were called the Shivaji Club. And the revolutionary cells used to go off, and the boys used to go, young boys, they would chant Sanskrit shlokas and kill some of the key British officials. And but at the same time, they used the cow and not eating the cow as a symbol of bringing all Hindus together. And in this context, Vivekananda is actually very interesting, because he said that don't eat cow, but eat meat. And why was he saying that? Because he wasn't saying be vegetarian. He said eat meat. Because at the same time, there was all this, there was this notion that if you ate meat, you would be like strong, and you would be a fighter. Vegetarians were considered weak. So he
Mm.
said, so there was this also this thing of, you have a taboo on cows eating beef, but you didn't have a taboo on the other things. And so when you look at the notion of a taboo, and that again, I went off into some of the scientific work, what you find is that if you hide the taboo amongst other things that you can do, then the taboo doesn't stick out, then you're not going to actually do the taboo thing. So what Vivekananda did was, he said eat all the meats except beef. So you didn't crave beef, but if you said don't eat bread, don't have bread, lemonade, a whole, and you can't do any of these things, then the taboo dish really stands out, right? So they've found these kinds of things in more
Nice,
recent stuff.
logical
Yeah.
way of dealing
Yeah,
with.
but the construction of nationalism or national identity continues even today, right? Because we still, there are these moves to sort of make um, a particular set of people Indian, and they want to sort of create certain, connect certain things with the notion of Indian. And which is why you have this fight about biryani versus poha, or don't eat beef and be a vegetarian, and that sort of stuff. So there is that particular ideological thing that comes all the way from the 19th century, so it has a long history.
Yeah, and then it also gets another dimension because then you have this whole cult of becoming vegan is another, you know,
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
a food trend, so to say, and a lot of people have turned vegan.
Yeah.
Um, I
Yeah.
find that quite amusing, actually. Um, so when we're talking about all of these things, what do cookbooks tell us about an era?
Mm.
And I'm
Yeah.
sure you have a lot of go-to because there's so many old recipe books that
Right.
have been we are aware of.
Yeah. So different eras. So you have like recipe books. So there are wonderful little, there's this, the Nimatnama manuscripts, which is in the 15th century, and that was created by a Muslim ruler, and who was a major gourmand. And they actually found this person, Nora Titley, actually found this manuscript in the 1950s in the British Library in London. So till then, it was sort of missing. So it begins with this whole thing of ode to the cockroach king, and says, it begins with this thing saying, "Oh, cockroach king, please do not eat my book." And I think the cockroach king was quite happy with that ode, and therefore did not eat the book, because the book was actually found in the 1950s. But so it's, right from the 15th century. But what those early cookbooks are written either by these princes or kings. And so there's a very it's like a very imperial sort of, it has ingredients that are very rare to find, or very expensive. And so you have that kind of a narrative. And then as you come into the colonial era, you have a more hybrid narrative, where you have sort of like the dopyazas, or muliktoni, which is molagatani, which is actually rasam. So you have the British sort of, Bombay duck. You have a whole bunch of them. So the British ones are more about taking the local ingredients and trying to sort of make it palatable to the British tastes, right? So there is that hybridity. But also in the British cookbooks, it's all about how do you deal with the natives. So there I have excerpts in the book about, the kinds of instructions you give to your servants. And for them, natives were all servants, right? So how do you deal with the cook, and what and make sure that there is this barrier. And you also end up with a narrative which is very hierarchical, because it's about the colon, which is very similar to the princely one, because it's, again, you have somebody who's ruling, and then you have the ruled. But when you come to the post-colonial era, independent India, the cookbooks become different, because the cookbooks become much more about the middle classes, and about, making it, bringing grandmothers recipes back in. And now you see much more of that, particularly with regional cuisines coming into play, and, cookbooks with regional cuisines. So here it's become much more democratic, and it's become more sort of less hierarchical. It's more about, let me share these recipes with you, and and there are no secret recipes anymore. Earlier, these the palace cooks and all had these secret recipes, but now there are no secret recipes. So, or there must be, but these are all coming out in these cookbooks. So I think it sort of shows a democratization of the actual way in which you actually have the cookbooks, but it also shows a little bit of sort of globalization. Because earlier, if you look at the earlier cookbooks, you find that all the things are put hodgepodge in there. They're like, you suddenly find a sweet, and then you'll find savory, then you'll find some sweet again. So there's no it's not like first course, second course, third course, but now you actually find you have meats, you have vegetables, you have soups, you have salads. So the cookbooks are also sort of refashioned to sort of appeal to a larger audience, and to an audience used to this kind of a linear um, course by course narrative. So yeah.
Yeah. So actually, what we are also seeing in today's world, and I'm talking about pre-pandemic times,
Mm,
is that there is this burst on social media and on Pinterest also and other sites online, where recipes and are really more accessible.
mm,
Um, and especially during our lockdown period, what I was observing happening on Instagram was like literally like a revolution.
mm,
Everybody took to cooking. Everybody was, and I'm classifying this as the urban population of India. Um, so we saw stark contrast. We saw all these home chefs mushroom, and
mm,
so many, even in my city in Jaipur, so many new home chefs have kind of started, uh, started the delivery services with cooking their own cuisine again. So there is this going back to local. So you saw that, and you saw this influx happening on Instagram and on Facebook, etc. A lot of cooking classes went online.
mm.
On the other hand, you saw the dichotomy with when we had our worker population moving from one state to another.
Mm,
And some people rose up to the occasion and gave food and kind of tried to do a supply chain, while others remained deprived.
mm,
Um, how do we, and this is rather problematic, how do we now define?
mm,
There is another dimension to the plurality and diversity in our country that's been added post pandemic or during pandemic with our relationship with food. Um, do you
yeah.
think this is something that should be a area of research and of study, because you are an academic? It's been on my mind to actually have a private conversation with you, but I brought it up right now. But have you given it a bit of thought?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things I've noticed with the very poor, so in the work that I had done, there was this thing about, does food have a religion, right? So there was this, and I looked at this thing about Hindu food, and an anthropologist had done a whole study on Hindu food, and so what he said was that Hindus look at food in a very instrumental way, because it is to do, food has a connection with divinity. So it's not about food per se, it's about food's connection with God, with divinity. So it's very instrumental. So so therefore Hindus don't really care about the production of food. They only care about using the food in sort of certain types of ways. So charity connected to food is not really there among Hindus, if you think of it that way, the instrumental way, right? Islam, on the other hand, has the connection with charity, because they do, give food at certain times, and they have all that. And for them, food in Islam, food is connected with nutrition. But it wasn't clear to me whether they were looking at it instrumentally or not. And I won't go down that path because I don't know. But if you were to take, say, Khare's this academics view on Hindus and food, what you find is that, so it's not surprising then that there was this indifference to the starvation, because what he says in his book also is you're going to find the Hindu sort of money lenders and sort of Hindu middlemen, they don't really care about starvation of the farmers. For them, it. Yeah, but at the same time, they will. they will give money, annadanam, and they will sort of have these ritual feasts, and they will feed a lot of poor people, but it's all very instrumental. So you're going to find this kind of um, very odd, sort of almost schizophrenic thing within Hindus. If you agree with that, then this sort of thing of being indifferent to the plight of a lot of people is not, given that India is about 85, 84% Hindus, is not very surprising if you agree with Khare's view, because there are lots of people who don't agree with that
Yeah,
view also, because there isn't just one Hindu way of doing things,
yeah,
right?
exactly.
Yeah. But what one also finds is that I think with with pandemics, and when you have like wars, this is almost like a war-like situation. Um, you find that people tend to be more, first they want to protect their own home and hearth, and figure and make sure that they are okay. And given that a lot of people are losing their jobs, and they don't know where their food is going to come from, it's not surprising that there is this indifference to the plight of many who've become extremely poor and who are starving, right? So I think that is very problematic. But and I think one of the things, like, as a political scientist, you always sort of look at, you look at these issues in terms of, do you look to the government and to the state to do something for you, or do you look to networks? So I think one of the things we perhaps need to think more about is these networks amongst citizens, rather than looking to the state, because the state can only do that much. They don't really have the money, and they don't have the interest either. But I think if one thinks about so many people who've gone out there and actually contributed to charity, and those organizations or NGOs have actually
One hundred
provided the
percent.
food. So yeah, but it has to be sustained, and that is not, that won't happen unless there is this momentum that is built up. And unfortunately, I think people will forget COVID as quickly as they can, because nobody wants to remember these times when things have been hard, right? So it's just human psychology that we will try and forget it as quickly as we can and go back to the way we were, which is, you have very stark differences between the rich and the poor. But one of the things that the pandemic, I should mention, I actually think that the pandemic has produced like two very conflicting ways in which we eat. And when I say we, I only mean the middle and the upper classes. I don't mean the really poor. So the eating patterns have actually changed. Not changed. So one eating pattern is to sort of go back to more traditional diets. So they want to do like turmeric and garlic, and use these kinds of things to stave off COVID. And the other pattern is that people who are tired of cooking, they want to get takeouts, get more processed foods, or rely on that. So you have these twin things going on, and they actually, within our bodies, you have these two streams of food being sort of eaten, and it's sort of very conflicting, because because we're going to have problems about the sourcing of the food, and the kind of thing, the quality of the produce, which is going to impact on the taste and on our health. So you're going to have all of that, and at the same time, people are also wanting to go back to turmeric and traditional foods, and saying that that might help them not get COVID. So I think you're going to see this sort of conflict between these two patterns in us.
I know what you're saying. This has been a very troubling time just to look at and observe what's happening outside of your own home front. And I mean, if you can help, we help. But how many people can also afford that? That's another question.
Yeah.
We are going to open it out. Excuse me. Sorry about that. We are going to open it out in another minute to for questions. But we've covered a fair bit of ground. On a lighter vein, how do you think you're going to use the? Because I know you're attempting fiction. Um, so is it? something about writing a novel to win a cooking competition. What is it that you're looking at?
What am I doing next, or what am I doing?
What is it? No, about writing a novel and
Oh,
or
right, right, right. Yeah, yeah. So one of the pieces, which is a fun piece, is about, how do you win a cooking competition, right? So I use the principles of crafting a good story, with a plot, to think about it. And so, and then I come up with these 10 commandments. So you begin with, it's like a Cinderella story. You begin, you're sort of down and out, you have these desires, but you can't really get anywhere. So in a cooking competition, you want to win the cooking competition, but you have to also be very careful that when you want to win the cooking competition, it can't be just about greed. It has to have something else. So you have to say things like, oh, it's to make sure that my very poor family will no longer have, they'll have better food to eat, etc., etc. So it has to be a rags to riches sort of a thing, um, uh, uh, an aim. And then as you go along, you begin to, you have to fail. So you can't, but you have to fail in a particular way, because you have to show you have to perhaps produce a bad dish, but the dish, when you go for the when you go and do the cook off, you have to produce a really good dish. So so that you remain in the competition. But what uh, in any story, you need to have reversals. You need to have sort of, you need a path that the person takes, right? And because in these cooking competitions, they actually interview people, both during while they're cooking, and they ask them questions, etc. You need to sort of think about it in ways in which you are developing as a person, and you need to project that, because that again is about character development. And and that makes the viewer sort of connect with you even more. So I sort of use the principles of storytelling, and sort of imposed it on some of the master chef, the one of the seasons, and sort of gave examples from how certain people did really well, because you also have to cry on camera when you fail, and but don't cry too much either. And, so
right?
sort of
You're actually like a master chef yourself, kind of wielding the whip,
that.
letting the story develop that way. Are we ready for questions? Do we have questions? Okay, so I'm going to mute myself, Shylashri, let the questions come in.
Sure. Yeah.
So I'd like to request, I'd like to request our audience to please use the raise the hand option to send in their questions. I will unmute them, and then you can ask your question to Shylashri. So I'm waiting for the questions. I think we have the first question from Gautam Sen.
Did you ever discuss or study the food that was brought in by the colonials, like berries, tomatoes, potatoes, which were not a part of our food before? In the archaeological findings, you never find anything of this sort. And how much that has changed the total cuisine of the Indian today. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, very good question, actually, because again, this goes back to things that we think have been with us forever and ever. But when you see, for instance, green chilies that comes in the 16th century, and you actually, it's very interesting. There's this whole, which I discuss in the book, where you look at the cookbooks of the Mughal emperors, and you find that green chilies come into the cuisine much later, with the later emperors, rather than with the earlier emperors, right? And so, and we used to use black pepper a lot earlier, but the green chili comes in my, and then it becomes part of our diet. So you have that, you have the tomato, you have the potato, you have a whole bunch of them that come in much later. And they then, and when they first come in, like I think it was a tomato which is called vilayati bengan, I think, or one, I think it was the tomato. It becomes very hard for people first to accept it. So they have to sort of connect that particular ingredient with something that is local, and then people will begin to use it. Or you have a war, like a coffee, for instance, as I mentioned, or and even tea. So only with some, with absolute deprivation of what they're accustomed to, then they begin to use the new thing. So in the book I actually discuss how these things come in, and how that then becomes, in the essay called invented traditions. So how it then becomes it becomes part of our tradition. And one thing I must mention, that even when all of these things come in, these researchers have actually found that Indian food has follows like a negative flavor pairing. So, for instance, if you have a dish, you're not going to find two ingredients in that dish performing the same function. So you will not have a tamarind and a lemon in that same dish. I mean, there may be dishes which have them, but very rarely. But in general, the principle is that two ingredients will not perform the same function. So if you put pepper, black pepper, then you're not going to put chili, green chili. So in that context, I don't think we've changed very much, but we have changed in terms of our use of ingredients. I mean, you're completely right with the that these some of these things have come in much later, and the book discusses that.
Thank you very much.
We have the next question coming from Sunita Bansal.
Hello, can you hear my voice?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. Now my question is, your book is, why is there such an echo?
There's an echo, huh?
Yeah,
Yeah, now I can hear you.
it's just when I speak, then the echo comes. Oh my God. Just a sec.
It's a bit like a horror movie, no? I mean, oh, she's gone.
So the next question is from Vanisha.
Hello, ma'am. So
Hi.
my question is, as your book has, it's a journey through India, and ours is a country that still believes in community living. So, what are your thoughts on how will food come to contribute to the identity of a nation that will go on choosing individualist living, especially Western countries? So, how will food contribute to the identity of a nation in such a context?
Yeah, I mean, I think given how, one of the things which I mentioned even earlier, which is that there is this absolute drive on the parts of different groups to make um, a particular way of dealing with food into a national way of dealing with food, right? So I mentioned this whole sort of the biryani, poha. There are certain things connected with the notion of Indian, and there are certain foods connected with that notion, and there are different groups trying to impose their own different ways of thinking about this connection. But I think, one thing that I found in throughout when I've been doing all this research is that we are very, very hybrid. So our national identity is very pluralistic, very hybrid, and it is impossible to say that one homogeneous way is our way. We are very, very heterogeneous. And I think that is how we have to think about our own national identity. Because if we, even when you think of yourself, for instance, or myself, in India, if somebody asks you, even when you go abroad, you may say I'm Indian, but within India, you when you talk to somebody else, you say, I'm from the south, I'm from the north, I'm from this state, or I'm from that state, right? So I think within India, there are these different states that come together and produce a particular mosaic, which is like a very hybrid mosaic. And that's what we are all part of. And outside of India, it is this hybrid mosaic that we take out with us. So, so I don't know whether that makes sense to you, but I think it's really important not to think of national as being homogenous or creating a particular identity. I think our identity is very, very hybrid. That's what.
Yeah. Thank you.
So I'm going to try Sunita Bansal next. I think we'll give her one more shot.
Thanks a lot. My question was that having heard you talk about so many things, have you referred to Ayurveda in your book? Because that is one, huge big treatise where it talks about how food is, it's used for healing, and also the tamasic, sattvic, and the rajasic foods. So how have you used that in your book? I mean, in what way?
Yes. So that comes into this whole, does food have a religion? And also it comes into this question of what defines regional cuisine. So what you actually find is that this Ayurvedic sort of food is the way in which the kinds of preparations that Ayurveda suggests is something that comes all the way down to our present time. So that is something that we actually see a link between Hindu and Muslim conceptions of food, because Ayurveda focuses on equilibrium, right? And having some kind of a balance, and then they have different foods are connected with different properties, and also each person has a different set of humors or a different sets
Yes.
of
Yes.
properties and imbalances, right? So now the Muslim one is also connected to that, except that their lineage goes back to the Greeks, ancient Greeks. Now we don't know whether there isn't much archaeological evidence whether ancient Greeks had any links with the Harappans or later. We don't have that particular link. So, but both of these traditions come into Indian cuisine and regional cuisine. So even today, our regional cuisines are very influenced by this notion of equilibrium. And both Ayurveda and the Unani school, they focus on precisely these. So in that you have the notion of humors, and here you have the
Yes.
doshas,
Yeah.
right? But I must mention one thing, which is that there is a difference between Ayurvedic notion and Hindu notion,
Oh
according
yes.
to
Oh yes.
this, yeah, because
Yes.
the Hindu notion of food is connected with spirituality.
Also.
Ayurveda has no connection with, does not
Exactly.
connect with spirituality. So I
Yeah.
think that is important to make
Yeah,
that
that's what I
distinction.
wanted to find out, because
Yeah,
actually Ayurveda has nothing to do with Hindu. It's the
yeah,
Vedic way of
exactly.
life.
Yeah.
So that's why I was wondering, when we talk of religion of food, Ayurveda is not really a religion at all.
Right, right. It's mentioned. I mean, it comes from the Atharva Veda, which is,
Yes,
but at
yes.
the
Which is
same
the Vedic
time,
culture.
it's to
Yeah.
do with just precisely these kinds of.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. That's wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Well, I think that gets us to the end of this very, very interesting conversation. Thank you so much, Shylashri,
Thank
because,
you.
and I would urge each one of you who's attended the session to please read the book, because you will discover many more hidden secrets uh, in Turmeric Nation. I'd like to
Thank you.
thank our sponsors once again, and also thank our audiences. Please do send your addresses to 98292 92244 within the next 48 hours, so that we can courier a copy of Shylashri's book to you. And you can make it a memory as well as a very enriching experience.
I hope you
Thank,
enjoy it. Thank you.
I'm sure everyone will. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me, and thanks everyone.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks.